a maximum security prison in upstate New York. 1,281 men incarcerated, forgotten, and pushed to the edge. In 4 days, 43 people would be dead, not from a jailbreak, not from an outside attack, but from decisions made by the people sworn to keep order. What happened inside Attica wasn't just a riot. It was a reckoning, and the world was about to watch. Stay with me, because the truth of what happened here is more shocking than anything Hollywood could invent. The world that built the breaking point, long before the first fist struck, long before the first guard was taken. The conditions at Attica Correctional Facility had been building toward catastrophe for years. To understand what happened in September 1971, you have to understand what life inside those walls actually looked like, and why the men in prison there believed they had no other choice. Attica was opened in 1931 in Wyoming County, in the rural heartland of western New York State. It was designed as a model institution, a correctional facility in the truest sense of the word. But by the late 1960s, the reality was something far different. The prison held nearly 2,200 men in a facility built for far fewer. Overcrowding was chronic, resources were thin, and the rules of daily life were rigid, dehumanizing, and by almost any standard of the era, punishing far beyond the letter of any sentence handed down by a court. Inmates were permitted 1 shower per week. They received a single bar of soap and 1 roll of toilet paper per month. Mail was heavily censored. Religious practice, especially Islam, which had a growing presence among black inmates, was restricted or outright denied. Work assignments paid as little as 25 cents per day. Educational opportunities were minimal. Medical care was inconsistent and often inadequate. The racial composition of Attica's population had shifted dramatically through the 1960s. By 1971, more than 54% of the approximately 2,200 inmates were black, and a significant portion of the remainder were Latino. Yet the entire correctional officer staff, every single one of the approximately 400 guards, was white. That gap between those who held power and those subject to it cast a long shadow over every interaction inside the prison's walls. Nationally, the period between 1968 and 1971 was one of profound social upheaval. The civil rights movement had cracked open the conversation about systemic inequality. The Black Power movement had given language to the frustration of millions. Prison reform activists, including figures like Angela Davis and the late George Jackson, whose killing at San Quentin Prison in California on August 21, 1971, just weeks before the riot, sent a shockwave through prison populations across America, had framed incarceration as a political and racial justice issue, not simply a criminal one. Inside Attica, men were reading. They were organizing. They were writing letters to the New York Commissioner of Corrections, Russell G. Oswald, laying out their grievances in precise, documented terms. In fact, a formal list of demands had already been submitted to prison administration months before September. Those demands asked for basic dignities: better food, access to legal counsel, religious freedom, an end to censorship of reading materials, and fairer discipline procedures. The response from Attica's administration was largely silence. The response from the state was minimal action on the smallest of grievances. And so the men inside kept waiting. But they were watching, too, watching what was happening to men like them across the country, watching what happened when the law failed people who wore handcuffs instead of badges. The fuse had been laid, thread by thread, year by year. September 1971 would provide the spark. It began as so many historic ruptures do, not with a grand declaration, but with a moment, a small, seemingly contained incident that, under different circumstances, might have been forgotten by morning. But September 9th, 1971, was not an ordinary morning inside Attica Correctional Facility, and the men inside those walls had long since run out of patience for ordinary responses. The immediate trigger traces back to the previous day, September 8th. Two inmates, Leroy Dewar and Raymond Lamoury, were involved in a confrontation with a correctional officer following a touch football game in the yard. The exact details of who provoked whom remain a matter of historical debate. What is documented and verified is this. Both men were placed in keep lock, a form of isolated confinement within their own cells, as punishment to the general population of Attica, already living under the accumulated weight of years of grievances. This was not a minor disciplinary matter. It was one more example of arbitrary punishment applied without accountability. Word moved through the cell blocks quickly. By the evening of September 8th, tension inside the prison was near its breaking point. Correctional officers reportedly sensed the atmosphere shift. Inmates communicated through the walls, through the yard, through the network of human contact that no prison administration has ever been able to fully sever. The morning of September 9th arrived. Shortly after breakfast, as inmates were being escorted back to the prison corridors from the mess hall, a confrontation erupted in a tunnel known as Times Square, the central intersection where four main corridors of the prison converged. A group of inmates overpowered their escort. A gate, later reported to have been weakened by a prior malfunction that had never been properly repaired, gave way under pressure. That failing gate became the pivot point of history. Within minutes, the situation escalated with a speed that caught the administration completely off guard. Inmates flooded into the yard. Correctional officers who could not escape in time were overpowered and taken as hostages. By mid-morning, approximately 1,281 inmates had seized control of the yard, the largest of Attica's 4 yards, along with significant portions of the prison's interior. 33 correctional officers and 3 civilian employees were held as hostages. One correctional officer, William Quinn, suffered severe head injuries during the initial takeover. He was transferred to a hospital outside the prison. He would die from his injuries 2 days later, on September 11th. The only hostage who died during the riot itself, and the only death confirmed to have occurred at the hands of inmates. Inside the yard, something remarkable and largely undocumented in mainstream historical memory occurred almost immediately. The inmates organized. Leadership emerged. A negotiating committee was formed within hours, composed of articulate, informed men who had been documenting their grievances for months. They established a perimeter. They protected the hostages from harm. They set up a medical tent. They created order in a space that the outside world assumed had descended into chaos. The negotiating committee drafted a list of demands, not ransom, not escape plans, but documented specific requests for improved prison conditions, amnesty for participants, and the removal of Attica's superintendent. They requested independent observers, including journalists, attorneys, and prominent civil rights figures, to be present for any negotiations. Their communication was precise and deliberate. Outside the walls, New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller was briefed. Commissioner of Corrections Russell Oswald arrived at the facility. The state's response was forming. And across the country, the eyes of the nation turned to a small town in western New York, where 1,281 men had decided that their voices would be heard, whatever the cost. For 4 days, DR at Attica Correctional Facility became something that no prison in American history had ever produced before: a negotiating table, not a metaphorical one, a literal, documented, observed back and forth between incarcerated men and the representatives of the state of New York. What unfolded between September 9th and September 12th, 1971, was not a siege in the conventional sense. It was a conversation, a deeply unequal, profoundly consequential conversation, conducted under open sky, with the lives of dozens of hostages hanging in the balance and the eyes of a nation watching. Commissioner Russell Oswald arrived at Attica on September 9th itself. To his measured credit, he chose, at least initially, to engage. He agreed to meet with the inmates' negotiating committee directly. Those meetings, documented by independent observers who were present inside the yard, produced a level of articulate, organized advocacy that surprised many who expected only chaos. The inmates' committee presented a formal list of 30 demands, later consolidated into 28, covering areas including improved food quality, medical care, religious freedom, access to legal representation, fair disciplinary procedures, and, crucially, amnesty from criminal prosecution for all participants in the uprising. That last demand, amnesty, would become the fault line that nothing could bridge. The Independent Observer Committee that assembled at Attica during those 4 days was remarkable in its composition. It included New York Times journalist Tom Wicker, who later wrote a landmark account of what he witnessed. It included attorney William Kunstler, civil rights activists, state legislators, and prominent figures from the broader social justice community. These observers moved freely between the state officials outside the walls and the inmate committee inside the yard. Their accounts, later documented in multiple verified historical records, form a crucial part of what we know about those 4 days. Inside the yard, the organization the inmates maintained was extraordinary under the circumstances. The hostages were kept together, largely unharmed. A medical station operated. Food was distributed. Inmate monitors, self-appointed peacekeepers, maintained order within the population. Observers who entered the yard noted that the atmosphere, while tense, was controlled and purposeful. The inmates had constructed a functioning community in the most desperate of circumstances. Commissioner Oswald, under enormous pressure, agreed to 28 of the demands in principle, a concession that represented a significant acknowledgment of the legitimacy of the inmates' grievances. But on the question of amnesty, his hands were effectively tied. The death of William Quinn on September 11th, the correctional officer injured in the initial takeover, made the amnesty question no longer merely political. It was now a matter of potential murder charges. Oswald could not promise what the law would not permit him to deliver. Governor Nelson Rockefeller, who remained at his estate in Botanical Hills throughout the negotiations and refused repeated requests from observers, and Oswald himself to come to Attica in person, was a figure whose decisions would ultimately determine the outcome. His absence from the negotiating process, documented extensively in the McKay Commission report, remains one of the most scrutinized decisions in the entire history of the event. By the evening of September 12th, the negotiations had stalled completely. The amnesty impasse was total. The Observer Committee, increasingly alarmed, communicated directly to the state that a forced retaking of the prison carried catastrophic risk. They were not wrong. The hostages remained in the yard. The inmates remained at the table. And somewhere beyond the walls, a decision was being made that would end the talking and begin something far worse. At 9:46 in the morning on September 13th, 1971, the state of New York made a decision that would reverberate through American history for decades. After 4 days of negotiation, after a documented impasse over the question of amnesty, after repeated appeals from independent observers urging restraint and continued dialogue, Governor Nelson Rockefeller authorized the forcible retaking of Attica Correctional Facility. What followed in the next 9 minutes would become one of the most scrutinized, most debated, and most consequential uses of state force against incarcerated people in the history of the United States. The operation was designated as a law enforcement action. New York State police troopers, approximately 500 of them, along with correctional officers, assembled outside the prison in the early morning hours of September 13th. They were equipped with firearms. Critically, and this fact was documented extensively in the McKay Commission report, They were not equipped with non-lethal crowd control weapons that were available at the time, including tear gas grenades designed for yard deployment. The decision to proceed with live ammunition as the primary tool of retaking was made and documented at the command level. At 9:44 a.m., a helicopter flew over D Yard and dropped CS tear gas, a chemical crowd control agent, into the yard below. The gas descended on everyone in the yard without distinction. Inmates, hostage correctional officers, and the makeshift medical station alike. Visibility dropped to near zero within the yard in a matter of seconds. At 9:46 a.m., state troopers opened fire from the catwalks, rooftops, and elevated positions surrounding D Yard. They fired into the tear gas-obscured yard below. The shooting lasted approximately 9 minutes. When the gunfire stopped, the scale of what occurred began to emerge through the settling gas. 29 inmates were dead or fatally wounded. 10 hostages, the correctional officers and civilian employees who had survived 4 days in D Yard, were also dead. Every single one of the hostages who died during the retaking was killed by gunfire. Every one, not by inmates, not by homemade weapons, by state-issued firearms, fired by state troopers and correctional officers in the assault. That fact, documented in autopsy reports, confirmed by the McKay Commission, and verified through independent forensic examination, overturned the initial public narrative that had been presented to the press within hours of the retaking. In the immediate aftermath of September 13th, state officials publicly stated that hostages had their throats cut by inmates, that several had been castrated. Those statements were false. They were contradicted directly and unambiguously by the Monroe County Medical Examiner, Dr. John Edland, whose autopsies confirmed that all hostage deaths were caused by gunshot wounds. Dr. Edland later stated publicly that he faced pressure regarding his findings. He released them anyway. The number of dead was staggering in its totality. 43 people lost their lives at Attica, 1 correctional officer during the initial takeover, and 42 more during or as a direct result of the retaking on September 13th. It remains the deadliest prison riot in American history, measured by total loss of life. In D Yard after the shooting stopped, inmates were ordered to strip and lie face down on the ground. Documented accounts, later verified by the McKay Commission and survivor testimonies, describe a period of significant physical abuse of inmates by correctional officers in the immediate aftermath of the assault. These incidents were documented, investigated, and confirmed in official records. The retaking of Attica lasted 9 minutes. The reckoning it produced would last much longer. The guns went silent on September 13th, 1971. But Attica did not end that morning. In many ways, legally, politically, morally, it has never fully ended. What followed the retaking of DR became one of the longest, most contested, and most consequential legal and political aftermaths in American correctional history. And the questions it raised about the use of state power, the conditions of incarceration, and the value placed on certain human lives remain as relevant today as they were in that gray September morning in Wyoming County, New York. The immediate aftermath was defined by an information battle. The false statements made by state officials in the hours following the retaking, claiming inmates had killed hostages by cutting their throats, claims directly and publicly contradicted by Monroe County Medical Examiner Dr. John Edland's autopsy findings, created a rupture between official narrative and documented fact that took years to fully close. That rupture cost lives in terms of public understanding, delayed justice, and shaped how the nation processed what had happened at Attica for an entire generation. The McKay Commission, formerly the New York State Special Commission on Attica, was established to investigate the uprising and its retaking. Its report, released in 1972, was a landmark document. It was unflinching in its findings. It confirmed that all hostage deaths were caused by state gunfire. It documented the physical abuse of inmates following the retaking. It characterized the assault as the bloodiest one-day encounter between Americans since the Civil War, a phrase that appeared in the report itself, and that has been cited in historical scholarship ever since. The report recommended sweeping prison reforms and placed significant responsibility for the outcome on state leadership, including the decision-making that led to the armed assault. Criminal accountability, however, moved at a profoundly different pace. In the years following Attica, grand juries indicted 62 inmates on charges related to the uprising. Not a single state trooper or correctional officer was indicted for the deaths caused during the retaking, despite the documented evidence that those deaths were caused by state gunfire. That asymmetry, 62 inmates charged, 0 state agents charged, became one of the defining grievances of the Attica legal aftermath. Governor Hugh Carey granted clemency to the remaining indicted inmates in 1976. The prosecutions effectively ended, but the question of accountability for the deaths caused during the retaking remained legally unresolved for decades. It was not until 2000, 29 years after the uprising, that the state of New York reached a settlement with surviving inmates and the families of those killed. The settlement totaled approximately $12 million, distributed among approximately 1,300 claimants. It was, by any measure, a modest sum relative to the scale of what had occurred. Critically, it came with no formal admission of wrongdoing by the state. The families of the deceased correctional officers, the hostages who died in the retaking, pursued their own legal action against the state, arguing that the decision to conduct an armed assault without adequate non-lethal alternatives constituted negligence. In 2005, the state of New York settled with those families as well for approximately $12 million. That settlement, too, carried no formal admission of liability. The legacy of Attica in American correctional policy is documented and measurable. In the years following 1971, New York State and correctional systems across the country implemented significant reforms addressing the specific grievances that the Attica inmates had documented and presented during the negotiations. Improved medical care standards, access to legal materials, religious freedom protections, enhanced grievance procedures. The reforms were not universal, not immediate, and not complete, but their connection to Attica is direct and acknowledged in correctional policy literature. Attica also changed how America talked about prisons. The uprising brought into the mainstream a conversation about the conditions, the racial composition, and the human cost of mass incarceration that advocates have been attempting to raise for years. It produced some of the most important prison reform literature in American history. It influenced legal frameworks, legislative debates, and the vocabulary of civil rights. What it did not produce, and what remains to this day a point of documented historical record, was full legal accountability for the 43 deaths of September 9th through 13th, 1971. The men who died in D-Yard, the officers who died in D-Yard, the 43 human beings whose lives ended in 4 days in a prison in upstate New York. They are the center of this story, not the politics, not the policy, not the decades of legal proceedings. The people. Attica was not inevitable. It was built year by year, neglect by neglect, silence by silence. And it ended the way things end when the people in power decide that force is cheaper than dignity. That is the lesson of Attica. It has not expired. 43 people, for days, 9 minutes, and 50 years of a reckoning that is still not finished. You have just watched the complete story of Attica, told without exaggeration, without fiction, and without looking away. Because these 43 people, the inmates, the officers, the hostages, the men who simply ran out of time inside those walls, they deserve a story told straight. And so do you as a viewer, if this documentary moved you, if you believe that history this important deserves to be heard clearly and honestly, then here is what I need you to do right now. Hit that subscribe button. Every subscriber tells the algorithm that stories like this matter, that history matters, that truth matters. You will be the first to know when our next documentary drops. And I promise you, the next story is just as important as this one. Drop a comment below. Tell me, what part of the story hit you hardest? The negotiations? The retaking? The decades without full accountability? I read every single comment. Your voice is part of this channel story. Share this video. Send it to someone who thinks they know American history. Post it, because Attica was buried for decades. Together, right now, we are making sure it is never buried again. This has been the Behind the Walls stories. The stories that were left in the dark, brought into the light. See you in the next one.